All right, everyone, welcome to part two. I'm just going to briefly recap storm warnings before I move on to Silent Spring. I just typed up a couple notes here. I thought maybe storm warnings would make more sense if we connected it to another poem as well to extend your growing knowledge of poems and how we might read them and look for some connections that maybe aren't quite so obvious on first reading. So one thing we can talk about with poems is the major metaphor, to look at the title, which is storm warnings in this case. So it's using weather as a metaphor, as I talked about in the last video. And it shows how we map, the poem is interested in how we map our spiritual journey or our existential journey. We exist, we're here on earth, what are we supposed to do with life, right? Or maybe even our inner consciousness, if we see this as probing how people feel about life and make decisions and whether or not we should feel happy or unhappy, right? But in this way, the poem is kind of like Negro speaks of rivers. It used rivers as a metaphor for something for the speaker to enter into. And of course, the rivers, they were based in certain histories and certain cultures where the rivers represented spirituality, and that poem is more joyful, I think, because of that, right? The metaphor here, that's not so different than the rivers, is that we're in our culture, and all cultures and humans tend to look at storms and just the weather as a metaphor for understanding ourselves or our existence here on earth. Of course, when you choose storm warnings as your major metaphor for a poem, it's going to be a poem that has more danger and threat in it than if you choose, rivers, and beautiful rivers at that. And so you can see how both of these poems are doing the same type of thing, choosing a major metaphor to explore culture, but also what it means to be human, and to explore sort of our inner psyche and where joy and meaning and the meaning of life come from. And so these two poems are very similar that way, but their difference in metaphors gives them a very, very different tone and feel. And we seem to have an answer to life in Negro Speaks of Rivers, that we can enter into history and into our culture, and we can find the meaning that we're seeking in life, the higher spiritual meaning. But here in this one, we're just kind of left with this sort of philosophical meandering that, there are lots of troubled regions. But here's the big thing the poem probably wants us to see. We see them as troubled because we're using storm warnings, the weather, which goes up and down and fluctuates, as the major metaphor for understanding life. Well, if you use that metaphor, you're going to see trouble sometimes. We don't see that type of trouble when you use the river and the flow of the river, everything that it offers as a metaphor. But both poems are exploring how humans use history and culture to make sense of their world, whether it be rivers or warnings. All right. And the last thing I might say is why the title. I might just point out, well, storm warnings are modern. We all check the weather often enough, yet they're ancient. We've been reading the clouds, leaves, etc. So storm warnings are an environmental issue, or that connection between humans and the environment, which is what our course is all about, of course. All right, let's talk about Silent Spring for a few minutes here. I'll just open up by reminding you that this is a really, really important book. We're reading just the opening few pages, but it is the book that spurred the modern environmental movement when it was released in the early 60s. In chapter 1, not in the introduction here, but in chapter 1 that you also read, you can see that clearly she's trying to teach people ecology, and she's trying to teach the effects of humans, that we have basically sped up the environment unnaturally through chemicals and basically science. It's teaching us more about the ramifications, the consequences of science, more than anything, and then eventually that becomes placed in the environment later in chapter 1. So that's what's happening here. Changes with chemicals, creating ecological imbalance, changes in farming that are creating ecological imbalance, and government policies that might actually change ecological balance as well. So that's the big picture. And for that reason, this is sort of our first taste of how an ecologist thinks. We've been reading poems and we talked about the fall narrative and the progress narrative. But this is an ecologist actually teaching us, hey, here's what I think of, here's how I see the world when I look at it for balance or imbalance. And so we're kind of moving into that portion of our course now. So Silent Spring makes sense here. And the next couple modules will start to deal more heavily with ecological thinking, and we'll start to apply that to critique poems and other readings as well. So that's one thing that I want you to take away from this reading. So here are the reading questions. We'll just kind of talk through this in a way that'll answer these questions. I'm sure you noted right away as we look through this when you read Fable for Tomorrow. It is written as a fable. Remember this book, I addressed this briefly in the preview video. it got a lot of pushback from the scientific world for two reasons. One, because of the way it was written, which engages the public and made it a bestseller, but also was not scientific enough to necessarily gain the respect of scientists. However, Rachel Carson was a scientist who had worked for various government agencies. She was very, very legit. But because of the way she wrote it, it was not accepted by some scientists. And it took the public to take interest in these issues to force scientists to start, many scientists, to start looking more at these issues and evaluating whether or not what we were doing was the best thing. The other thing that's worth mentioning is she was also accused of being a female scientist and therefore irrational. She was an irrational, hysterical woman, which is very unfair. But this is a time in history, not all that long ago, the 1960s, where women were seen as not capable of doing man's work, science, right? So you can see that there's also just some gender issues, right, that we see going back to Adam and Eve and the reading we did on that women are irrational and men are rational. And we see that, 2,000 years later, basically, in Silent Spring, a book that's only half a century old. So, Fable for Tomorrow, I'm sure you got it. This is a picture of what could happen. It's sort of apocalyptic in its own way. It's almost science fiction-y, I suppose, but it's also a fable, which is an ancient genre of literature. What happens in it? We see this very, very beautiful area. We're supposed to appreciate it for its own beauty, right? Which is something that the modern environmental movement does. It's not just how we use nature, as it was with Adam and Eve in some of our past readings, but now we're supposed to appreciate it for its own beauty, right? And so we see that in the beginning, and then we see things going wrong. It's really interesting because we see first agriculture hit, so that's not just the countryside, but it's our food supply. So she's forecasting that there are going to be food supply problems. And that nature itself, the ecology, starts to die in this paragraph, right? We're back to farm animals here. And also, I guess I missed, here is where families and human health appears as well. So it's an environmental problem, but it's also a food supply problem, which threatens humans, and the humans themselves are getting sick. So those are the basic things that she's teaching people early on, because those will be her arguments for changing our ways. We're going to have ecological problems in nature, but it's not just nature. We're going to have human problems as well. And that's what this is doing. And then she comes back to beauty, appreciating nature in its own right. And so that's what she's doing in the opening, if we want to just talk about it in a simple way. From there, then, she starts to get into the obligation to endure. The title itself gives us her argument. We are supposed to live, right? So this moves away from any sense that we don't have to be stewards of the earth. We're clearly inside of the environmental movement at this point, and we are supposed to be stewards of the earth and care for nature in its own right. We're not just supposed to use it for our own selfish purposes. Although one of the things that we can credit Carson with is always, always, always focusing on the humans and human problems. She doesn't just say that, nature is as important as a human, but rather she knew that to persuade people, she had to focus on the human, which turns out to be very, very true in research, that you can persuade people to care about environmental issues by showing them the human consequences. This page is where our ecological and evolutionary education begins, right? She's talking about the beginning of time and how things slowly formed, and then how humans have sped that up over time. We really see the speed metaphors come on here. And here's where we can start to see, and this answers one of your questions too. The questions are basically, what are the big ideas? What type of language does she use? The most alarming of all mans, of course she means humans, assaults, right, are right here. And we see a lot of other language. Kill vegetation, sicken cattle, harm. So this is the language of crisis and harm and threat. And so she's using that very well. You don't see that all the time in scientific language, but she's writing to the public, writing basically environmental nonfiction. And so we see that inside of here. You'll want to remember this because we will read other things that were written before this in future modules. And we could call them environmental writing, earlier environmental writing, but it won't have this emphasis on harm or the chain of evil that some aspects of human scientific innovation create, right? And so this was a very, very different type of essay in that it talked about threat and risk and these type of things, rather than the beauty of nature. She talked about the beauty of nature, and then she's talking about how we're killing it. And so this is a very, very different critique, and it'll seem different when you read earlier pieces. We'll just leave it at that, I think. Bringing us into some good scientific thinking here on the speed, the rapidity of change, speed, deliberate pace of nature. So she's showing that she's making an argument that we're going faster than nature can handle, and that's the cause of our problems, right? So we see that with her metaphors and her language here. And then she starts to list some of the problems: the sprays, that we're killing all of the insects, not just the bad ones. Points out things that people didn't think of back then that are pretty common now in our environmental and ecological thinking, even if we're not scientists. That through evolution, the strongest insects have survived, and they're going to be more immune than the others. And then we got to keep putting more toxins and more poisons on things to kill those insects that become more rugged, evolutionarily speaking. And so the public wasn't really thinking like this. I think we all know this now in the modern day, but this is the book that started to teach people all about these things. She also talks about government policies here, and how if we have less agricultural land committed to growing things, then we can expect to have more pest problems as well. We wouldn't have a food shortage or a potential food shortage if we just used all of our land to grow food. But if you try to grow more food on less land, then it's harder to do so, and then we need the sprays, right? So she's pointing out the irrationality or the illogic of some of the policies. The last thing she does, she starts to talk again about human health here, the disease-carrying insects when we're packed into cities. But she also talks about else that's important in ecology, and that is what we call monocultures, single crop farming. And this isn't the way that nature grows, right? Nature always has a variety of species in any area, but when you start to get rid of those and you plant, as she says, nothing but wheat, you can expect to have more problems because we don't have ecological diversity. And so modern farming is not ecologically diverse, and that increases the pests because the ones that love wheat can be there and hurt the wheat. Then we have more chemicals, right? And so she's starting to point out the chain of problems when we move away from ecological diversity and non-ecological thinking. And she uses it again in the area of agriculture, because that is the countryside oftentimes that we drive through is an agricultural countryside, farms of corn and wheat and whatnot. But also it's an easy way, I think, to show potential threats to humans and to the food supply. And that is what she's trying to teach in here. So if those are the things you were seeing as the major ideas, she's teaching ecological diversity, how we're speeding up the evolutionary process at a pace that nature can't withstand, and that we're threatening our own human existence as well. Those are the big ideas, and we see the ecological teaching going on. If you're happy with that, I'm happy as well. Last thing I asked you to read was this article on carbon capture technology, and I just said, hey, let's look at modern media and let's see where the fall and recovery and some of these assumptions that are ancient from Module 1.1 still pop up in modern journalism and support, perhaps positively, perhaps negatively, our environmental thinking. So one way to look at this that's real simple is to look through here and say, okay, where do we see scientific evidence that these things will work? Where do we just see sort of, I don't want to say a blind trust or a blind adherence to these narratives, but something like that? Answers, there might have been a lot of places where you saw fall and recovery. This whole thing seems to be fall because it's climate change. Here's recovery. People have done too much damage to the climate to avoid catastrophe. There's the fall. They'll now have to re-engineer the world, according to scientists. That sounds hard. I hope we can do it. I sincerely mean that. But that is the recovery narrative. You can see there's in this article is that recovery depends upon technology. That's the silver bullet, carbon capture technology. Remember, we learned that right away in our first module. And so this article is a great example of that. I think this article does well. It kind of challenges some of the assumptions that technology can save us when it says, while it's technically feasible to slow fossil fuel use fast enough, it won't do it. So it has a pretty good discussion of what technology or other changed behaviors might be able to do, like using less resources, right? And it says that this is going to be difficult, but in the end it says that technology is our savior, right? That is the progress we need to fix this problem. And probably true, but you can just see how the thinking here is supported by fall or recovery. We want to look at another supportive statement that uses the recovery narrative. We could look at this quote: we're absolutely going to have a significant amount of carbon removal, no question about it. So a large belief in the recovery narrative. Thank you.